Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is the deep dive where we take a stack of sources and get right to the core of what they're saying.
And today we are wading into a topic that, for a lot of people, might sound, well, it might sound a little off, spiritually speaking.
Yeah, especially if you come from a tradition that's all about piety and self-sacrifice. The topic is Christian hedonism.
It's absolutely a provocative term. And let's be honest, that word hedonism does most of the heavy lifting when it comes to, the initial misunderstanding.
Right.
So our goal today is to look at the sources, and we're primarily drawing from John Piper's book, Desiring God. We want to understand the actual theological claim being made.
We want to see how the pursuit of your own personal satisfaction gets recast. It's not some selfish sideline,
Right.
but a moral, God-ordained thing you have to do.
And the tension is obvious from the get-go, isn't it?
Oh, completely. We're so often taught that spiritual maturity means choosing duty over delight. You sacrifice your self-interest to honor God. You're supposed to make yourself smaller for His sake.
But these sources, they propose something just fundamentally different. They argue for a vision where there's no conflict between those two things.
Okay.
It's all captured in this one declarative statement, which is really the thesis for the whole philosophy. God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him.
And that statement, if you accept it, doesn't just adjust your theology a little bit. It kind of flips the whole engine of Christian practice around.
It does.
If your greatest duty is served by your greatest joy, that changes everything. It changes your worship, your ministry, your whole view of morality.
Precisely. If that's true, then our spiritual effort has to focus on how to increase our delight in God, not how to crush it.
So what's our roadmap for today? How are we going to unpack this?
Well, we're going to show why this isn't some modern invention, but actually a return to some very deep historical roots. We'll dissect the grammatical change that really defines the whole doctrine. Then we'll look at how classical Reformed thought kind of paved the way for this command to pursue happiness. After that, we'll analyze why joy is a divine command, and then finally see how pursuing this satisfaction in God is the only real way to conquer sin.
All right, let's jump right in then. Let's start with that central assertion. For centuries, the Westminster Shorter Catechism has been the summary. Man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. That's bedrock for our tradition.
It's the traditional beloved formulation, no question. The sources, though, they propose a really subtle but a revolutionary grammatical change.
Okay, what is it?
They propose that the chief end should be understood this way. The chief end of man is to glorify God by enjoying Him forever.
So we're just talking about replacing a conjunction and with the preposition by. That sounds like we're splitting hairs, but you're saying it creates a massive shift.
It does, because and suggests two separate activities. Maybe they're sequential, maybe they're just equal. You could call it the ham and eggs model. You do your duty, that's the ham, and then you get your joy, that's the eggs. They're separate dishes on the plate.
I see.
But the revised thesis, using by, argues they are fundamentally one thing. Enjoying God isn't the separate reward for glorifying Him. It is the method of glorifying Him. The satisfaction is the engine, not the exhaust.
So we're moving from two different activities to a single unified action, one act that fulfills both purposes at the same time. How does that practically unite God's passion for glory and our passion for satisfaction?
Well, the sources explain this unity as happening in the act of worship itself, specifically Christ-exalting worship. When we worship God, what are we doing? We are seeking satisfaction.
Right.
We're seeking the deepest possible satisfaction. And when we find it in Him alone, that very act of finding joy in Him shows His infinite worth. We're basically testifying that God is the most satisfying person in the universe, and that's the honor He desires.
So this resolves that apparent competition between what God wants and what we want. The relationship isn't antagonistic at all, it's reciprocal.
Exactly. It gets rid of the idea that God demands we just, martyr our own happiness for His benefit. If you boil it down, the exchange is this. We get the happiness in Him, He gets the honor from us. Man honors God through the vigorous pursuit of satisfaction in Him.
I think we need to stay here for a second. Let's think about what duty looks like without this engine. So let's say I perform some act of service, charity, whatever, but I do it grudgingly, just out of sheer willpower and a sense of I have to do this.
If you do that act grudgingly, you might technically fulfill the duty to the person you're serving. You give them the money or you do the task.
Okay.
But in that act, you are not glorifying God. Yet, in fact, you might actually be dishonoring him.
Why? How?
Because your grudging service demonstrates, it sort of advertises, that God is not enough to satisfy you, even while you're doing your duty.
Yeah.
It suggests the loss of your time or your money is a greater loss than the gain you find in reflecting God's generosity.
So the lack of inner delight becomes a kind of spiritual slander.
It is. But when we find God to be the source of our most lasting satisfaction, when we are happy to perform a duty because we are happy in the God who commanded it, we're naturally showing him to be surpassingly valuable.
We're advertising his worth to the world.
Yes. And that act of advertising, that demonstration that God is better than everything else, is the glorification he's after. The duty is the container, you could say, but the joy is the content that actually gives God honor.
That completely reframes what we think of as selflessness. True selflessness isn't crushing all your desires. It's desiring the highest possible good, which is God, and then letting that delight overflow into service.
And that has to lead to a certain intensity. If the enjoyment is the means of glorification, then Christians should be the most enthusiastic, most intense pleasure seekers in the whole world.
Right.
Provided, of course, that the pleasure is anchored securely and singularly in God himself.
Okay, so that brings up the immediate counterargument. You hear this especially from people who grew up in traditions that really stress self-denial. They'll say that this whole Christian hedonism thing is a modern distortion. They'll say it twists the classic Reformed catechisms, which were all about duty and doctrine, not happiness. But the sources, they mount a pretty robust defense by looking at the structure of the Heidelberg Catechism itself.
And this is a really crucial defense. When people accuse this idea of distorting the catechisms, they often just overlook the starting gun of the Heidelberg, which is rooted entirely in human well-being and the need for assurance.
That's a good point. The Westminster Shorter Catechism starts with duty and vocation, man's chief end. But the Heidelberg Catechism, it starts with personal crisis and comfort.
Precisely. The Heidelberg begins by addressing the question of just existing in times of trial. Question 1 asks, what is your only comfort in life and death? It immediately centers the entire theological system on the individual's need for peace.
And question 2 takes it even further.
It does. It asks what you have to know to live and die happily. The German word is seliglich.
Right, that word seliglich. Can we give that a bit more context? Because in English translations, you sometimes see it as blessedly, but the sources say the original German really carries the weight of happiness, of well-being.
In 16th century German, seliglich certainly meant blessed, but in the context of the Reformation, it carried this huge weight of experiencing saving comfort and true, lasting well-being. It's the opposite of eternal misery, so the whole catechism is framed to answer this basic human concern. How do I achieve a state of lasting happiness and assurance, especially when I'm facing death?
It's telling the person listening, your happiness is our starting point.
Yes, that's a big deal for a historical document. This document, written in 1563, it doesn't start with abstract systematic theology. It starts with your desperate need for comfort and happiness.
And the answer to question 2 then lays out the 3 things you need to know, which becomes the structure for the whole document.
And that whole system is presented as the answer to the question, how can I be truly happy? The 3 parts just follow logically from that.
Let's just detail those 3 parts again, but let's look at them through this lens of pursuing happiness.
Okay, so first, you have to recognize your misery, your sin. And this is necessary because you can't appreciate the cure if you don't understand how bad the disease is.
Yeah.
A happy person is only cured when they know what they're cured of.
Makes sense.
Second, how you're redeemed from all that sin and misery through Christ. This is the source of the comfort, the pathway to true seligkeit. And third, how to live thankfully for that redemption. And this thankfulness, which includes doing good works, is essentially the joyful life lived out of that redemption.
It's so easy to get bogged down in the substance of those 3 things, sin, redemption, thankfulness, and completely miss the framework.
Yeah.
And the framework itself confirms that this quest for well-being is the engine driving the whole theological instruction.
Absolutely. The Catechism doesn't critique the desire for happiness. It critiques the object of our desire. It redirects that innate human yearning away from fleeting things on earth and points it toward Christ as the only secure, everlasting comfort.
So this proves that the core concern of Christian hedonism, this quest for satisfaction, isn't some foreign idea. It's intrinsic to the historic Reformed theological method. The roots are deep.
And that historical continuity is so valuable because it protects the concept from the accusation that it's just another self-help program dressed up in religious language.
Right.
This isn't about feeling good about yourself. It's about finding the good that satisfies the soul. And the fact that a confession from over 450 years ago frames its entire instruction around how to live and die happily validates the idea that we are meant to be pleasure seekers, as long as our aim is true.
Okay, so we've established that enjoying God is the way we glorify him. Now we have to confront the really radical idea here, that seeking this satisfaction isn't just a nice option, it's a moral duty. It's a spiritual task commanded by the Creator.
Yes, and the sources argue that if you try to separate joy from duty, you fail at both. You can't truly honor God or love people if you try to operate without this engine of, well, self-interested spiritual delight.
So where's the biblical mandate for this? I mean, it sounds like the most counterintuitive command in the Christian life.
The primary citation is Psalm 37.4, "Delight yourself in the Lord." And this is presented not as a suggestion, you might want to try this, but as an active instruction. God has appointed this specific way, the act of delight, as the method for humans to give him honor and to find their own well-being.
But I feel a challenge coming up here. When we talk about duty and command, we immediately think of things we must do, often reluctantly.
Sure.
How can you command an emotion? Joy is usually seen as spontaneous, something you can't control. Isn't commanding someone to be joyful almost psychologically cruel, especially if they're facing real, crushing suffering?
That is a critical tension, and the sources face it head-on by redefining what we mean by joy. This isn't about a superficial, fleeting happiness that depends on your circumstances. It's a profound, settled satisfaction in God's character and his sovereignty.
Okay.
So when the Bible commands joy, it's commanding us to pursue and cultivate the kind of knowledge and meditation that produces joy, knowing that the object of that pursuit, God, is eternally worthy of it.
And the sources connect this right to Jonathan Edwards, who helps solidify why joy isn't just an accessory to worship, but its core element.
Yes, Edwards made a crucial distinction about what glorification actually is. He argued that God is glorified not only by his glory being seen, by an intellectual understanding or a dutiful knowledge of it.
Like a fact you learn.
Right, but by his glory being rejoiced in. If a person sees God's goodness but just remains indifferent, God is only partially honored. But if they see his goodness and their heart is seized by this spontaneous delight, then God is honored to the fullest. The joy is the required response to the reality of his glory.
So when we see God's glory and we rejoice in it, we are confirming that his glory isn't just true, but that it's supremely desirable.
Exactly. The delight is the required proof of God's value. Think about it. If you look at something infinitely valuable and your heart feels nothing, you are basically testifying that the thing is, in fact, not infinitely valuable.
Yeah.
Therefore, joy is not just a nice feeling, it's an essential component of honest worship.
This redefines spiritual disinterest or apathy as the highest form of insult.
It does. The sources argue that to not enjoy God is to dishonor him completely. It's to commit sacrilege.
Sacrilege.
Think of it this way. Sacrilege is the violation of something sacred. If God is the sacred supreme object of the universe, and you claim that something else, your possessions, your comfort, some worldly pleasure, satisfies your soul more than he does, you are committing a spiritual violation. You're claiming God is inferior to the things he made.
That analogy helps. It's like telling your spouse, look, I fulfill all my marriage duties, I take out the trash, I pay the bills, but I find spending time with the neighbor far more satisfying. The dutiful act is just completely undermined by the absence of affection or delight.
The analogy holds perfectly. If you approach God out of mere grudging duty, you are essentially insulting the infinite worth of the one you are supposedly honoring.
Okay, let's pivot to the practical duties that this joy is supposed to sustain. The sources stress that this spiritual delight isn't just for quiet time and contemplation. It's the strength for the hardest parts of life and death.
The phrase, "the joy of the Lord is your strength," from Nehemiah 8.10 is critical here. As a believer faces spiritual battles, or just the natural weakening of the body with age, they can't rely on their own natural strength or good circumstances.
Right.
They have to draw strength from a wellspring of spiritual satisfaction. That internalized joy in God becomes the psychological and spiritual energy they need for endurance.
And this command for cheerfulness, it extends to specific acts of virtue that we might naturally find just draining.
Absolutely. Think about acts of mercy. Romans 12.8 says that the one who contributes or gives aid must do it with cheerfulness. If you give money or time to someone in need, but you do it with a heavy sigh and a resentful spirit, your lack of cheerfulness actually diminishes the gift itself.
Why is that?
Because you're implying that the money or the resource you gave up was a better source of joy than the act of selfless giving, which is supposed to reflect the joyful generosity of God.
And the same principle applies to suffering loss.
Yes, Hebrews 10:34 says believers joyfully accepted the plundering of their property. I mean, how can anyone joyfully suffer loss?
I don't know.
Only if the loss of their worldly goods is completely overshadowed by the supreme satisfaction they find in the security and treasure they possess in God. The external circumstance is terrible, but the internal condition is one of contentment in the object that can't be taken away from them.
So joy isn't a reward you get after you do the virtuous thing. It's a necessary condition of the virtue itself. It demonstrates the truth of the sacrifice.
It's the proof. And this applies even to leadership. The sources cite 1 Peter 5:2, where pastors must tend the flock willingly and eagerly, and Hebrews 13:17, which asks the congregation to make sure their leaders can keep watch over their souls with joy. If the shepherd sees his task as a tedious burden, the flock suffers, and God is dishonored. The command is clear. Delight must fuel every part of Christian living and service.
We have to move on to what feels like a philosophical correction. When people hear Christian hedonism, they often equate it with being selfish. But the sources bring in this key insight from C.S. Lewis that just flips conventional morality on its head.
Lewis is the hinge here, for sure. Conventional morality, whether it's religious or secular, usually assumes the problem with humanity is that we're too selfish. Our desires for our own good are too strong.
Right.
And Lewis just rejects this. He says, our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak.
That statement is completely counterintuitive. If our desires aren't too strong, then what's the flaw? What's the problem with the human condition?
The flaw is in the weakness of the desire and the inadequacy of the object. People are, as Lewis puts it, far too easily pleased. We are finite creatures who were designed for infinite satisfaction, but we settle for these temporary, low-yield worldly pleasures.
He used that image of the ignorant child, right? The child who would rather keep making mud pies in a slum than go away on a holiday to the sea.
The mud pies of appetite. That's the tragedy. We settle for something tiny and fleeting because we lack the imagination or the passion to long for the infinite feast that's on offer.
So the goal of this theology isn't to suppress our longing for happiness. That longing is God-given. It's to intensely cultivate that longing and direct it toward the only object that can actually satisfy it.
The search has to be oriented in God himself.
We need to be really clear here. God is the end of the search, not the means to an end. So if I'm pursuing God mainly so that he'll give me a better job or cure my illness, am I doing Christian hedonism correctly?
No, that would be pursuing the mud pies and just using God as the shovel. In genuine Christian hedonism, God himself is the supreme treasure you're seeking. We want his presence, his character, his fellowship, because he is the deepest and most lasting source of happiness.
The external blessings are secondary.
They have to be. If the external blessings vanish, the internal satisfaction in God must be enough.
This brings in that observation from Pascal about the restlessness of the human heart.
Yeah, Pascal, the 17th century mathematician and philosopher. He saw this universal longing for happiness. He called it the law of the human heart, that every single action, even suicide, is performed with happiness as the goal. And then he said that humanity has this infinite abyss inside them, a vacuum, that can only be filled by an infinite and immutable object, that is to say, only by God himself. The moment we try to fill that infinite need with a finite object, a career, a relationship, an addiction, we fail, and that cycle of restlessness just continues.
So redirecting our hunger for happiness toward God is the only rational response to being human. Anything less is just irrational spiritual starvation.
It's the only way to get congruence between the desire and the object. And when we manage to redirect this intensified longing toward God, the process itself naturally overflows into the expression of praise. And that connects us right back to Lewis's argument about praise completing enjoyment.
So how does praise function as the appointed consummation of enjoyment?
Lewis notices that all enjoyment spontaneously overflows into praise. Think about how naturally a music lover praises a symphony, or a hiker praises a beautiful view. They don't praise out of duty. They praise because the enjoyment feels incomplete until it's expressed. The act of expressing the satisfaction makes the satisfaction whole. It consummates it. Therefore, worship that's motivated by joy isn't selfish, because the praise is the necessary, honest expression of satisfaction in this supremely valuable reality. If we truly enjoy God, we must praise him.
Which means that if our worship lacks joy, it's not just poor worship. It's a confession that we haven't truly enjoyed the thing we claim to value.
It's an announcement of dissatisfaction. And this superior satisfaction, it isn't just for our emotional fulfillment. It's the ultimate strategy for spiritual warfare. It's the mechanism for breaking the power of temptation.
How does gaining this satisfaction translate into a concrete victory over sin?
The key to breaking the allure of sin is finding something better. Sin offers short-term, low-yield pleasures. Long-term triumph over sin doesn't come from sheer willpower, from gritting your teeth against temptation. It comes from gaining a genuine distaste for worldly seductions because you have a superior satisfaction in God.
If God is a deeper feast, the temptation starts to taste like ash.
Exactly. When the joy of the Lord is our strength, we're armed against the assaults of our spiritual enemies. We are, in effect, putting our mouths out of taste for the low-grade destructive pleasures that the tempter uses as bait. The Christian fights sin not primarily by moral effort, but by maximizing spiritual pleasure.
Okay, this theology, it often sounds like a beautiful paradox, this unity of joy and suffering. And the sources really bring this down to earth by highlighting historical and biblical figures who actually lived this reality. This shows it's not just some abstract theory.
Right. The sources identify several key witnesses. The primary witness is Jesus himself. He voluntarily entered into the ultimate act of suffering, the cross, for the joy that was set before him. That's from Hebrews 12:2.
And what was that joy?
It was the pleasure of accomplishing redemption and returning to the Father. So even in his deepest agony, his motivation was a kind of self-interested delight in fulfilling God's plan.
And then there's the Apostle Paul, who just constantly modeled this paradoxical existence.
All summarizes perfectly in 2 Corinthians 6. He describes himself as sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. His external circumstances, shipwrecks, beatings, imprisonment, physical hardship, were a source of legitimate sorrow.
Of course.
Yet, his inner condition was anchored in the all-sufficient God, which resulted in a constant, non-contingent joy. Sorrow and joy coexisted because his ultimate satisfaction was untouchable by his external misery.
And what about the more practical witnesses, the people who gave up worldly comforts for the sake of mission work?
Those are the ones who model the ultimate validation of this, the missionaries and those who have left everything for Jesus. Their conviction, often expressed at the end of a very difficult life, is, I never made a sacrifice. They calculated the cost and concluded that the fellowship with Christ and the treasure of his presence infinitely exceeded whatever they gave up. Their life is the living proof that God is a better source of satisfaction than any earthly possession or security.
The sources also detail how the author, John Piper, found this truth to be personally sustaining over 25 years from the book's first publication in 1986. And that period included some significant personal and cultural trials.
And that personal validation is key to the message's credibility. The author noted that his body aged from 40 to 65, and his marriage advanced 25 years. That's a period that included navigating the very real difficulties of midlife, a time when he and his wife sought counseling.
Right.
So the core message, that satisfaction in God sustains us, had to be tested in the furnace of personal aging and relationship struggles. The theology had to work when the natural joy and ease of youth had faded.
And culturally, that 25-year span was marked by massive dislocation. You have the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of the internet, smartphones, and of course global terrorism with 9/11. Why did the message stay compelling through all those shifts?
Because the deep, unchanging spiritual realities have remained constant. The message's relevance holds up because God is still gloriously all-satisfying. The human heart is still a factory of desires, and sin is still powerfully and suicidally appealing.
It doesn't matter what technology we're using or what the political landscape looks like.
Right. The fundamental battle is always spiritual consumption. Where will we drink? Where will we feast? That battle never changed, from the mud pies of the 1980s to the digital mud pies of the 2000s.
If anything, it became more intense.
Absolutely. The siren song of the internet and endless digital connectivity offers fleeting, shallow satisfaction. It just amplifies the need for a superior object of satisfaction. The message to feast on God became even more urgent as our attention spans shortened and distractions multiplied. It offered an anchor to an unchanging, infinite reality in a world of accelerating novelty and anxiety.
And the message also proved its credibility globally after 9/11, when the world was gripped by fear. That period actually led to a significant theological addition to the book.
It did. The sources note the addition of a chapter on suffering. This was vital because a theology that promises joy has to account for genuine, crushing suffering on a global and personal scale.
It can't be a Pollyanna-ish view.
No. It had to affirm the biblical reality that God appoints suffering for his children. This wasn't a claim that Christian hedonism stops suffering. It was a demonstration that it provides the necessary spiritual strength in the suffering. It proved its merit by showing how believers could truly be sorrowful yet always rejoicing. The truth had to sustain the loss of life and the threat of war, not just minor inconveniences.
And as physical strength inevitably fades with age, the focus returns to Nehemiah. The joy of the Lord is your strength.
It is the ultimate test. It links this modern articulation all the way back to the Puritans, like Richard Baxter, who prayed that loving God and delighting in Him might be the work of our lives. When delighting in God is viewed as the work, the actual job description, even as your natural energy decreases, you possess a necessary inner spiritual strength for ministry and endurance right up until death.
The longevity and the personal testing of the message really confirm its essential truth. The pursuit of superior satisfaction in God is the key to life, to strength, and to Christian virtue. So, this deep dive into Christian hedonism has been a necessary look at the structure of our motivation. We started with this radical premise that the chief duty of man isn't to glorify God and enjoy Him, but to glorify God by enjoying Him.
And we've established that the pursuit of joy in God isn't a selfish distraction. It's a moral duty and the necessary engine of worship. The problem lies not in the strength of our desire for happiness, but in its weakness, as we settle for those temporary low-yield mud pies of appetite when an infinite feast is available.
This whole philosophy calls us to intensify our innate longing for happiness and to direct that powerful, God-given hunger only toward the supreme object, God Himself. That act of maximal satisfaction in God is the greatest honor we can give Him, and it's the ultimate weapon against the empty promises of sin.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to carry into your week. If we acknowledge that seeking true happiness is a necessary component of all genuine worship and all virtue, consider a specific act of service or a ministry in your life that you currently perform out of a sense of difficult obligation or just duty. How could that obligation be reoriented this week to become instead an act of profound, sincere satisfaction in God? How can you turn that grudging compliance into a joyful expression of finding your supreme treasure?